closet has been burglarized over the weekend, blue books that you will be writing your responses in, and we will explain at the time of the exam how we want those blue books filled out. We have special instructions about that. They're not very complicated, but we're going to insist that you follow them because it will make our grading process easier and more efficient. Any questions? Okay, well, let's get back to where we were, and we'll proceed as far as we can. Where we stopped today, we'll pick up next Monday. My basic point is that the United States health system is the mess it is, and it is a mess, and it is a disgrace and an outrage in terms of how much is put into it in terms of resources and how comparatively little comes out of it in terms of good measures of health status as compared to other leading countries which invest fewer resources and spend less per capita but get better outcome measures. The reason that we have this mess in our system I identified as two principal reasons: that we have a very imperfect market, to put it as gently as possible, a really messed up market situation, and we have a costly, wasteful, and inefficient multi-payer third-party administrative system. Those are the two, in my mind, solid reasons for why the U.S. is the outlier in both the literal statistical sense and in the more figurative sense of being weird compared to other countries which are doing a much better job with their resources by every measure that we can muster. Now, the question then is, why do we have those two very important negative factors that influence our health system? And my answer to that question is, again, twofold. It's kind of a binary approach. The reason that we have such a screwed up market, and the reason that we have such a costly and excessive, wasteful administrative third-party system, multi-payer system, are because we have, first, very confused and conflicted national values that allow such a mess to grow up in our midst and then to persist. And secondly, we have a history in which efforts at health reform that go back more than a century, that really started, as far as we can tell, with Isaac Rubinow about 1904, turn of the 20th century in the United States. Our history from that point forward has been confused and conflicted. It has been troubled and tumultuous, and we're still, at this point in our history, trapped by that troubled and tumultuous history, in part, not only, but in part because we are ignorant of that history. And it's a good illustration of that famous maxim, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So most Americans don't know the history we've been through, and that's why we keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it and making the same kind of stupid mistakes and political decisions based on real lack of knowledge about our history. So we are going to try to review the history at its high points that I think would give us some perspective. And obviously, you could spend whole semesters just doing the history. I have a graduate course that does that to a large extent, really starting at 1920 and going forward, and still run out of time with all the focus that we can put into a graduate course with extra readings. And here we have maybe a couple of days to give an overview. We'll come back to more history later in the course, but what I'd like to see as the first basic historical unit is one that goes about 60 years roughly from 1904, 1905, when Rubinow becomes active and an organization that he begins to work with, the AALL. the American Association of Labor Legislation, and we'll talk more about that, begin their campaign. That campaign is picked up by the Progressive Party, whose standard bearer is Teddy Roosevelt, who had been a president of the United States, now ran on as a third-party candidate, picked up a lot of the agenda of the AALL, especially about health reform, and I will like to carry that in some very broad strokes through the passage of Medicare, and with it Medicaid in 1965 as one very important chunk of history. How we got from Rubinau's ambitions and Rubinau's perspective in 1904-05 down to our national program in the form of Medicare, with Medicaid as a kind of afterthought but closely linked to Medicare in its political process, is something that we need to understand. Here are the basic sources that we're going to weave together to construct that history. We're going to look at Shi and Sing. There is a section in Shi and Sing from pages 82 to 105. The syllabus says 101. It should be 105. That's an error I didn't catch before we distributed the syllabus. So it's to 105. The most important pages in that 23 or so page spread are pages 96 to 105. And I will point you to particularly relevant and significant passages in that, and I will offer you my own perspective and, in some cases, critique of what Shi and Sing attempt to do. I commend them for their attempt, for their recognition of the importance of historical perspective. I commend them for trying to do their homework and reading some reasonable sources, but I also think that they, as in other parts of the book, make some errors in emphasis and in selection, and I'll try to correct them. There are a number of blackboard readings that go with this historical section. So there is, for example, the Byrne, Brown, Fee, and Lear piece that the Obama administration cited in the Supreme Court brief. You can read the actual paper they cited. It's on Blackboard. There is a short paper that Liz Fee and I, two of the four authors, put together on Rubinau, in which this is part of a standard feature that we introduced as editors, history editors of the American Journal of Public Health, to the journal. And it's now in its 20th year. The journal is in its 100 and whatever, 17th year. But the section called Voices from the Past, Liz and I introduced when we became editors together in 1997, that we continue to the present, still going in a very robust form. What we do is select an important historical source. And of that important historical source, we pick out a maximum of about 1,500, 2,000 words that capture the essence of that primary source. And then we build a little essay around it, a mini essay that gives you something of the biography of the author, the political context of the time in which the piece was written, and so on. And so one of our very first, I think it was our second actually, of these Voices from the Past essays was based on Isaac Max Rubinau's important groundbreaking paper, which was called Labor Insurance, which he published in the Journal of Political Economy in 1904. We have a selection from Rubinau that we've carefully picked to highlight what we think are the most important meanings. And then we have a little essay giving you Rubinau's, the essentials of his biography, political context, and something about the struggles that he went through. So that's another thing that's on Blackboard. We have an article by Alan Derrickson, who is a very respected, mostly labor historian. He's been at Penn State most of his career. Alan Derrickson writes a lot about the role of labor in political advocacy for proper worker safety regulations and for health insurance and things of that sort. And so this is an article in another section that Liz Fee and I co-edit, which is called Public Health Then and Now. Those are analytical essays written primarily by PhD historians, but not necessarily. You can be an MD, and if you put in enough time and effort and are willing to take good criticism, you can write a decent historical piece. Because you have an MD does not qualify you to write a decent historical piece. Training in editing may help. So some of our authors are PhD historians, most of them. Some of them are MDs, some of them are DRPHs, doctors in public health, and other folks. Some of them are just people who have developed the interest in the knowledge base and have submitted an intelligent historical piece, which is peer-reviewed, and within our guidelines, certain number of words and references and formatting and so on, get published as historical essays in the American Journal of Public Health in the section called Public Health Then and Now. The message being we take a public health instance or confrontation or major turning point from some time in the past and then tease out the implications for present policy and present dilemmas right now. It's a very popular section in the journal, and we intend to keep on editing this as long as we're able. One of these pieces was Alan Derrickson's Health for 3/3 of the Nation, Public Health Advocacy of Universal Access to Medical Care in the United States. And there are some very important parts of that article relevant to the story we are constructing. There is another Voices from the Past piece that Liz and I had a hand in putting together. This one is based on the work of C.E.A. Winslow. C.E.A. Winslow was one of the country's leading public health figures in the first half of the 20th century. He was the guy who founded the very respected Yale program in public health. He was an editor of the American Journal of Public Health. He was president of the American Public Health Association. He was editor of the American Journal of Bacteriology, etc., and so forth. A very distinguished man, greatly respected in international circles, an advisor to the League of Nations Health Organization in the 20s and 30s, an advisor to the World Health Organization in the 40s and 50s. There's a very important piece that he published in 1926, which was actually his presidential address that year to the American Public Health Association, and so we've selected a portion of that. His address was called Public Health at the Crossroads, and we have some passages from that that are particularly relevant to this story. And then there's the last handout, which is the first of a couple that will be coming this semester, a selection from the book that Georges Benjamin, I, Sue Ladwig, and Elise Berkman put together and published in 2012, The Quest for Health Reform, a satirical history. The story is told in political cartoons. Okay, let's now start. Those are our sources. I'm going to be weaving these in and out. It's going to be a balancing act, but let's see how much of the story we can get through before we hit the witching hour for today, and then we'll pick it up. Story starts really with Rubinow, as I've already pointed out. Rubinow was a very brilliant, well-educated scholar and physician who knew better than literally anyone else in the United States at his time what European systems had actually created in terms of a social safety net. Various kinds of social legislation for workmen's compensation when workers became injured on the job, for sickness insurance when they were too ill to work and would be deprived of income, and then their families would be in major trouble, and all sorts of retirement income, what happened when workers reached the end of their work life. People's lifespan and life expectancy was much shorter then than it is now, so when people reached the age of 60, 65, they really didn't have the capacity to continue work any longer, especially if their labor was physically based, not desk-based, but even that was very challenging. So all these things had been addressed in European context, and Rubinow was the guy who brought those ideas to the United States and was very successful in bringing attention to it. He was able to work with and become a leader of the organization called the AALL, the American Association for Labor Legislation. Labor legislation meant legislation that would create just these safety nets that I have been referring to. Workmen's compensation. It didn't exist in the United States before the AALL began its campaign, and on a state-by-state basis succeeded in getting the country by about 1914 to adopt workmen's compensation laws, rules, procedures if a worker were injured on the job. Those measures, with some modification, persist to this day and are still state-based as they had been created at that time. If you turn to page 2 of this handout, the one with Rubinau's photo on the front, you will get to the very first political cartoon that I am aware of on a health theme that was published in the United States. There may be some other, but in my own research and in the work of the 4 of us who put the book together, we couldn't discover an earlier one than this, so we say this is cartoon on a health theme number 1. As you can see on the bottom, it was published in something called the American Labor Legislation Review in 1910. That was the journal published by the American Labor Association. American Labor Association for Labor Legislation. And the message of the cartoon is very, very clear and clever. You have an English worker on the left who is holding over his head for protection from the elements, the assaults of life, a very full umbrella with all the panels filled in with important pieces of labor legislation. Health insurance in the front, invalidity insurance, old age pensions, industrial accident insurance, unemployment insurance, etc. All these things were part of what good labor legislation had achieved in those more progressive and advanced European countries, Germany, Belgium, England, France, etc. The American worker, notice chauvinistically, I don't think it's an accident, that the American worker is depicted by the cartoonist as physically taller and perhaps more robust than the English worker. That's a bit of American chauvinism, obviously. But notice that the American worker is holding an umbrella with only one panel, lots of spokes with nothing between them, because the cartoonist is capturing the reality of the American circumstance as compared to the English or European circumstance. And the message here under the cartoon is, which umbrella would you prefer on the inevitable rainy day? Obviously, the message is, I would prefer the English umbrella. I would have so much more protection from the elements, from the assaults of life. And why don't we Americans have what the English already have? Hidden message, I think, being, if we don't get good umbrellas like the English, then our natural advantage of physical strength, robustness, height, will be beaten down. We'll be beaten down by the elements, we'll shrivel up, and will become puny in comparison to our industrial allies or competitors, depending on how you want to see it, over there in England. The message is very, very strong and clear, and that's one of the ways in which the message was effectively conveyed. If we turn to the third panel, the third page of that handout, we see another cartoon that uses the umbrella theme. The umbrella theme was very popular. It was picked up by many cartoonists. To this day, you can see umbrella cartoons that use the same basic approach. It's become sort of part of the furniture, if you like, of political cartooning. This is about a different stage in that campaign. The first one was published in 1910. This one was published in 1919, still in the American Labor Legislation Review. The theme here is more subtle, and we have to know a little context. The basic context is this. Whereas European countries, by this time, 1910 or thereabouts, 1920, had accepted for many decades that a responsibility of the federal government, of the central government, was to provide health and welfare measures to support the working citizens of those countries as a central mission of the central government. The United States did not get to that political point in its evolution until sometime in the 1930s. Essentially, a half a century after Germany did in the 1880s. We got there only in the 1930s, and we got there only because we were in a massive depression, economic downturn, part of a worldwide economic downturn that terrified lots of people. Lots of people declared, people who wouldn't normally be expected to say this, that capitalism had failed, and that we had to save our citizens from the ruins of capitalism. Capitalism had failed worldwide, it seemed. And as a result, in response to that, after some fitful efforts and some lack of courage, Franklin Roosevelt began to shape what became known as the New Deal, and to create the kind of legislation for the United States at the federal level that had already been created 50 or 30 or so 20 years before in European countries. The United States, until this time, was bound by its Constitution, or at least its interpretation of the Constitution, and its political culture, which was based on a fundamental suspicion of the federal government and the belief that the federal government should do as little as possible to interfere with what states were doing and what business and other groups in society were doing. That the role of government was to get out of the way, not to oversee and regulate, which was a very important part of the European tradition for some half century longer than in the United States, and it was only in the middle of crisis that we reluctantly, kicking and screaming, came to that position. So in the 1910s, we were still in the midst of a very federated period of our political history, in which it was understood, as the Constitution says, that the place in our government system where health and welfare measures are taken care of is at the state level. So New York will take care of New Yorkers, and Wisconsin will take care of Wisconsiners, and Michigan will take care of Michiganders, as I'm told they're called by a native of Michigan. I was hoping they'd be called Michiganers, but that's a Yiddish term. Means crazy people. Anyway, Michiganders is what they like to call themselves. Anyway, each state would be responsible for its particular citizens. That's where health and welfare measures had legislative authority, where the Constitution seemed to approve them, and it was only later through an evolution, complicated constitutional and Supreme Court history and backing and filling and so on, that the federal government developed that authority in New Deal administration in the 1930s. So when the AALL and all the people who supported it, members of who supported AAL, besides people like Rubinow, many college professors, some union leaders, not all union leaders support, but some union leaders did, some progressive business leaders, social scientists. It was a whole variety of people who joined together to create the American Association of Labor Legislation, and what they could share is the belief that the United States, to move forward, has got to adopt, wherever we can, some of the basic worker protection measures, labor legislation. For example, another piece of labor legislation that was very significant at the time and fought over bitterly was child labor laws until the 1910s. Children, sometimes boys as young as 6, would work in the mines and would be at great risk. Many of them were killed, or if they were on various coal chutes and sorting pieces of coal as they whizzed by in special conveyor belts, losing their fingers or arms and so on. This was perfectly legal until it became illegal, and that required a campaign by groups like the AAL. This was labor legislation to prohibit child labor and to create conditions that would be appropriate for all labor for women who were working and so on. So the campaign for a sickness insurance law was at the state level. What the national organization did, the AAL did when it had its convention, its meetings, Rubino gave rousing speeches and so on and wrote articles, is to craft a model piece of legislation. This is what legislation should look like, what the essential features of it should contain for New York's law about creating a sickness insurance mechanism for workers working in New York State. And Michigan could take the same basic outline, the protocol, the model, and adapt it slightly differently for the particular needs of Michigan workers. And California could do the same, and Pennsylvania. The idea was then to have each state craft, at the level at which it was recognized appropriate, health and welfare measures based on a national prototype modified for local circumstances, reflecting local needs and priorities. And that's exactly how workmen's compensation worked. That's exactly why workmen's compensation succeeded after state after state. And if you happen to know anything about workmen's compensation today, you will realize that it's still at the state basis. It was never changed from the early 19-teens when those measures passed. There are some modifications and specifics, but that it is state-based rather than federal is the way people approach these issues. So when it came time for sickness insurance, same thing. Let's craft a prototype sickness insurance measure, and let's work with local folks in New York, Michigan, Wisconsin, California, wherever. There were folks who wanted to see this through, create political alliances, enlist local labor organizations, gather the support, build the momentum, and so on. All of that is necessary to explain this cartoon on page 3. You can't read it because I don't think you can, I couldn't read it, because the writing is so small there on the right, but I've been able to go back and find out what it really says, magnify it and so on. It says, New York Women's Joint Legislative Committee. That's significant because a number of important and progressive political forces converged to get this measure to the attention of the New York State legislature. It was the women's movement. It was the attempt to gain the vote for women, and this was at the height of it, the suffrage movement. And so it is no accident that the central figure, the figure of strength and nurture in this cartoon is the mother, cradling the baby in her arms, to whom her husband looks with admiration at her strength and power and centrality. This is a cartoon that was particularly favored by the New York Women's Joint Legislative Committee, that not only pushed for the franchise for the right to vote for women, but had a political and social agenda connected with that. Where women rose to power, then it was presumed, and in many cases was the case, that progressive legislation, like labor legislation, followed. And so here, the woman as the central, powerful figure, the center of her family, the center of strength, to which husband and grandpa and the kids all look for support and strength. She will be the real prop for that health insurance umbrella, a full one that will protect the family from the elements, from destitution and from sickness. That's an important message here and an important part of why the campaign succeeded differently in different states. The campaign proceeded well right up until about 1917. States were coming aboard. The American Medical Association, which had been founded in 1847 as an organization of regular American physicians, that is opposed to homeopathic physicians or other sectarians that were rife in 19th century America. The American Medical Association was perceived at first by many physicians as just another self-interested trade group. They were the anti-homeopaths. They weren't particularly smarter or better educated or more ethical than others. They were just following out their own interests. In order to achieve greater recognition and greater political authority, the American Medical Association, at around the turn of the 20th century, entered a new phase. And so instead of being led by folks who would give the AMA the tone, the flavor of a trade association, just narrowly protecting, selfishly protecting its own interests against the public if need be, against other rival practitioners of medicine, the AMA took the high road and said, we are interested in the reform of everything to do with American medicine. We will support legislation for the first version of a Pure Food and Drug Act, which eventually passed in 1908 and then was modified many times since. But that we will support efforts to reform medical education. We acknowledge that medical education is very spotty and of very uncertain quality, so we need to establish some national standards. We'll support national reform effort, and we'll throw our weight behind it. And we will support progressive legislation, such as sickness insurance and workmen's compensation. So for a time, from about 1900 to roughly 1917, the American Medical Association presented itself as and was recognized as a progressive professional organization that wanted to have various kinds of reforms passed, including reforms about sickness insurance, reforms about medical education, the purity of drugs that were sold, what the marketing allowances were, and so on. The reason that happened was because the AMA knew it was strategically useful for their political struggles to gain more authority. They needed to present themselves as altruistic and above board. And during that period, they invited, as leaders of the organization, they invited people who were very, very respected academic medical leaders to also become leaders of the American Medical Association, to accept nomination and election as president of the AMA. Such leading medical educators had steered clear of the AMA before that time. Now they were convinced. So a very important president of the AMA during this period was William Henry Welch, who was the admired, respected, and beloved dean of the Johns Hopkins Medical School when it was first founded, and for its first 20, 30 years. He was revered, he was respected, he was scientifically capable, he was politically enlightened, and so he would be the perfect person to convey an image of a progressive, enlightened AMA. He was offered the presidency, and he accepted it. No doubt thinking that, well, I know this organization needs to be brought to a higher level, to be less self-interested and more interested in the national concerns. So if I accept the leadership that they're offering me, I know their motives, they're pretty transparent, but if I accept it, I can perhaps turn around and influence them. And he was one of a succession of major national medical leaders, people of utmost respect and authority, who accepted the AMA presidency. In this same period, from 1900, 1905 to 1917, the AMA said, well, there is this movement that's being spearheaded by the AALL, people like Rubinow, and now supported by Teddy Roosevelt in his 1912 presidential campaign, incorporated into the platform of the Progressive Party that we should have a sickness insurance program in the United States. Well, we should jump on board that too. And what better way to do that than to hire Isaac Max Rubinow himself, a leader of the AALL, a founder, by the way, in 1904 of the American Socialist Party. But we don't care. He's a progressive leader. He is the country's leading authority. His voice is without comparison. So the AMA hired Rubinow to be at least the figurehead, the symbol of their commitment to health reform. And Rubinow's particular job was to work with various states as those states built particular momentum. If there's momentum building in California, dispatch Rubinow to California for 2 or 3 months, see what he can do. If there was now a campaign in New York, bring him back across the country, have him work with people in Albany or elsewhere around the state to achieve that. As Shi and Singh point out, though, by the spring of 1917, the AMA took a sharp turn to the right. The country took a sharp turn to the right. And just as Rubinow had been hired in 1916 to lead the efforts of the AMA to progressive legislation, in 1917 he was fired. Hired by the AMA, fired by the AMA. Once the AMA returned to its own basic political focus, threw out its academic leadership, threw out progressive people like Rubinow, and began to be part of the opposition to national health insurance, a position they maintained at least through the passage of Medicare in 1965. The AMA only publicly changed its position and endorsed some version of health insurance as a positive thing only in the 1970s, and there in a very selective way. But from 1917 to at least 1965, later actually, they were in the opposition and joined with many other groups in opposition. The commercial insurance industry, political figures on the right, etc. And why was 1917 such a pivotal year? A turning in a very dramatic direction away from reform efforts, the ending of progressivism. When did the progressive period end? If you have to give it a year, it would be 1917. When all the efforts to reform the slums and get child labor laws passed and have other forms of liberal legislation part of our national structure, that all crashed in 1917. 2 major political events in the world happened. The United States entered on the side of the Allies World War I. That war had been underway since 1914, and the United States was a very isolationist country, didn't want to be involved in foreign entanglements as they were seeing, and only was persuaded in 1917 to get into the war. And still, a very significant percentage of the country was opposed, and so the Wilson administration, it was Woodrow Wilson who was president then, created a special commission called the Creel Commission, headed by a guy called Creel, to drum up propaganda, to paint the Germans as barbarians, as people who skewered infants on their bayonets. They created this hateful, awful set of rhetoric and cartoons. They enlisted the very young Hollywood film industry to do the same thing. And the basic mantra was, health insurance created in Germany under Bismarck. That's the same Germans who skewer babies on their bayonets. We don't want that. We don't want anything German in our American life. And throughout all the American academics who had been supporting it, all the deans of medical schools like Welch who had been supporting it, all the experts in political economy like Rubinow who had been supporting it, all fired, turned away from, and the AMA dug in its heels. The other major factor that contributed to this turn of events was the Russian Revolution in the fall of 1917, whether October or November, depending on which calendar you're using, the Bolshevik Revolution. And so lots and lots of fears of where socialism might lead and how violent it might become now seemed to suddenly become real. And anything that was socialistic, democratic, as Rubinow had been, and the groups that he belonged to, suddenly became just another bomb-throwing, bearded Bolshevik revolutionary aiming to bring down government by violent means. And we had the first of what became a feature of struggles for health insurance in the United States, the first major Red Scare. This is part and parcel of the Bolshevik effort to undermine the United States. You can get a flavor of that on page 5 of that same handout on the right side, a cartoon at the time, which is born of this Red Scare mentality. There are the Bolsheviks, they're coming in as immigrants, they're running around with bombs, Uncle Sam is having a hell of a time rounding them up. We should get them deported, that ship says deportation, send them back, send them. Some of this rhetoric sounds familiar. Surprise, surprise. But they're going to sneak back in and do great damage to the United States. We've got to eliminate these Bolsheviks or people like Rubinow who came from Russia and had all these bad ideas. Another example of the Red Scare is the cartoon on the left there. This represents the great contest between, these are wonderful caricatures by the cartoonist. Morris Fishbein is the guy who is the source of the caricature on the left. He is the major figure in the AMA in this period, the editor of the German American Medical Association. And the figure on the right looks remarkably like Rubinow to me. Compare the cartoon caricature with the actual photo of Rubinow. The little round glasses, the little goatee, and so on. Looks like Rubinow to me. It also looks like your archetypical Bolshevik, doesn't he? And which is, of course, the message. Anyone who looks like that, sounds like that, with his little Russian accent, can't be trusted and is trying to undermine us. And then the last part of that, here is a pamphlet that was produced, if you read it carefully, is opposing socialistic and German measures. State health insurance is known in Germany as Reichskrankenversicherung, and clearly we don't want that un-American stuff on our soil, and we don't want this Bolshevistic crap. It is sponsored by that patriotic organization, the New York League for Americanism, which will fight these foreign intrusions. A hint of what's really going on here. You can actually look up in historical registries what businesses or people resided at these two given addresses, one in Buffalo and one in Syracuse. Who wants to guess, when you tracked it down, what actually existed at the so-called offices of the New York League for Americanism in upstate New York? What enterprises actually were in those locations? Anyone? Commercial, for-profit insurance companies. These were obvious right-wing sponsors for self-interested reasons of these so-called groups that were trying to pretend they represented grassroots American attitudes. It was propaganda created to fight a measure that would threaten the business of commercial insurance companies. Red Scare and its exploitation, and we'll have to end here.